This isn't some story I read in a book. It's a chapter from my own life, a chapter that began long after I thought all the dramatic pages had already been written. It's strange how you can live for 76 years, build a legacy, and think you know the people closest to you, only to find out you're a stranger in your own home. The leather of the conference room chair felt cold against the back of my neck, a stark contrast to the familiar Arizona sun I'd left outside. My entire life, or what was left of it, was contained in a thick, navy blue portfolio sitting in the middle of a glass table so polished I could see my own tired reflection. We were here, my son David and his wife Amelia, to finalize what they called my legacy planning. Then, with a slick, practiced smile that never reached her eyes, Amelia slid a document in front of me and tapped a yellow sticky arrow pointing to the signature line. "Just sign here, Dad," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "and the conservatorship is all taken care of. It's just a formality, to protect you. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." The word hung in the sterile, air-conditioned space. Conservatorship. It wasn't a word associated with legacy planning. It was a word for invalids, for the mentally incompetent, for men who were no longer men. It was a cage, and they were holding the key, expecting me to willingly lock myself inside. My hand, which had designed and overseen the construction of half the commercial buildings in Scottsdale, began to tremble. I looked at my son, my only child, David. He was staring intently at a water stain on the ceiling, his jaw tight, refusing to meet my gaze. That was his tell. The same way he'd looked at the floor when he was 8 and broke my favorite drafting pencil, the same way he'd stared at his shoes when he'd crashed my Cadillac at 17. He couldn't look at me when he was ashamed. A conservatorship? I finally managed, my voice sounding thin and foreign to my own ears. Amelia's smile tightened just a fraction. She was a corporate lawyer, specializing in hostile takeovers, and I could suddenly see she wasn't just David's wife anymore. She was his counsel. I was the target. "It's for the best, Arthur," she said, using my first name, a subtle shift from the dad she'd used just seconds before. The change was a calculated demotion. "After your fall last month, and the confusion you expressed at the hospital, we feel it's the responsible thing to do. The court will see it as a loving act to safeguard your assets." My fall. I tripped over a garden hose I'd left out myself. And my confusion was from dehydration and the fog of a painkiller they'd given me in the ER. They were twisting a minor, embarrassing incident into a weapon of cognitive warfare. The portfolio on the table wasn't a summary of my life's work, it was the prize. Every stock certificate, every property deed, the company I'd bled for and built from nothing. I looked down at the paper. Petition for conservatorship of the person and estate of Arthur Finch. My name. My estate. Their control. "I'm not signing this," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of the steel that had once commanded boardrooms. I pushed the document back across the table. Amelia didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands, her manicure immaculate. "We had hoped you'd be cooperative, for David's sake. It's cleaner this way. But it's not strictly necessary. We've already filed the petition with the court. We have medical evaluations, declarations from concerned parties. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Your signature would have just been an agreement to the inevitable." The arrogance was breathtaking. The condescension was a physical blow. They weren't asking. They were informing me of my own execution. They had doctors. Plural. Who were these concerned parties? The new, young physician they'd insisted I see, Dr. Evans, who'd asked me a series of odd, rapid-fire questions about past presidents and what I'd had for breakfast. The neighbors they'd been so friendly with lately? The betrayal wasn't a single act, it was a conspiracy, meticulously planned behind my back, in my own home. I had spent a lifetime building a fortress of wealth and security for my family, and all along, the enemy was already inside the walls, drawing up blueprints for a coup. My mind raced backward, collecting the breadcrumbs I'd been too blind, too trusting, to see. It started subtly, maybe 6 months ago. Amelia, over one of our Sunday dinners at their sprawling home in Arcadia, a home I'd helped them buy, had started asking pointed questions about my finances. "Just curious from a professional standpoint, Dad," she chirped, "how are your assets structured? Trusts? LLCs? It's fascinating how your generation handled wealth management." I, like a fool, had been proud to explain my system of trusts and investments, happy that she was taking an interest. I thought she admired my acumen. In reality, she was taking inventory. Then came David's sudden interest in my online life. "Dad, you really need to be more secure," he'd said, sitting at my mahogany desk in my home office. "Let me help you set up better passwords. I'll just save them for you, in case of an emergency." An emergency. He was the emergency. He sat there, my own son, my heir, and methodically logged every key to my kingdom while I thanked him for his thoughtfulness. The memories were shards of glass in my mind. The helpful suggestions. The casual inquiries. The feigned concern. They were like termites, quietly eating away at the foundations of my autonomy, preparing for the day they could make the whole structure collapse. I had outlived my wife, my friends, my business partners. I had outlived the era of handshake deals and unquestionable integrity. I was a relic, and they were the modern demolition crew, here to clear the land for their own benefit. Back in that cold room at the law offices of Sterling and Croft, the air crackled with my silent fury. I looked at Amelia's smug, placid face, a mask of predatory calm. I looked at my son, who finally chanced to glance at me, his eyes full of a pathetic mixture of guilt and greedy resolve. He was weak. I had always known he was weak, but I had mistaken his weakness for kindness. Amelia was not weak. She was the architect of this demolition, and my son was her willing, spineless contractor. They saw a frail old man, a signature away from being erased. They saw a bank vault with a fading heartbeat for a lock. They didn't see the engineer who had stared down union bosses and weathered 2 recessions. They didn't see the man who had built something from nothing with his bare hands and a brilliant mind. They had mistaken age for infirmity. They had mistaken grief for senility. They had mistaken my love for weakness to be exploited. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly, but I willed them to be steady. The reflection in the glass showed a man stooped by age, but his eyes, I was glad to see, held a fire they had failed to notice. I left the pen on the table. "The hearing is in 3 weeks?" I asked, my voice now devoid of any tremor. Amelia nodded, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at my sudden composure. "That's right. The 14th, at the Maricopa County Superior Court." I looked directly at David, forcing him to meet my gaze. The shame was still there, but beneath it was something harder, something Amelia had put there. A defiant entitlement. He believed this was his right. He believed this was his due. He was no longer just my son, he was my adversary. I let my eyes drift back to the portfolio, the sum of my life's work, and then to the document that sought to steal it all. A lifetime of building, and they thought they could dismantle it with a single piece of paper. I leaned forward, placing my palms flat on the cool, unyielding glass of the table. "You've made a terrible mistake." My mind wasn't foggy. It was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I wasn't just going to fight a conservatorship. I was going to dismantle the life of lies they had so carefully constructed around me. They wanted a war? I would give them a war. But not in a courtroom full of their hired doctors and rehearsed lies. I would fight it on my own terms, in the world I had built, using the tools they couldn't possibly comprehend. I turned and walked out of that office without another word, the click of the heavy door shutting behind me sounding less like an ending and more like the cocking of a gun. The first casualty of this war would not be my freedom, it would be their delusion that I was already defeated. They thought the fortress was theirs for the taking, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who knew all of its secrets. My first call wasn't to a lawyer. It was to a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a forensic accountant I'd used 20 years ago to root out an embezzler in my company. He was brilliant, discreet, and possessed a bloodhound's nose for financial filth. He was also, thankfully, still in business, operating out of a nondescript office in downtown Phoenix. I met him the next morning. I didn't tell him about the conservatorship at first. I didn't want to frame it as a family squabble. I framed it as a security audit. "Marcus," I said, sitting across from his cluttered desk. "I'm 76. I'm thinking about the future, about simplifying things. I've given my son and his wife significant financial assistance over the years. Gifts, loans, investments. I have my own records, of course, but they're an old man's records. I want a complete, professional accounting of every dollar that has flowed from my accounts to theirs for the past decade. Every wire transfer, every check, every loan for a failed business venture. I want it all traced, cataloged, and valued." Marcus, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with skeptical curiosity, leaned back. "A family audit, Arthur? That can get messy." "Messy is fine," I replied. "I want to know where every brick I gave them went." I explained how I'd funded David's succession of disastrous startups, a gourmet dog food delivery service, a bespoke surfboard company, and Arizona, of all things, an app that was supposed to connect local artisans with buyers. Each one had folded, costing me hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'd paid off their credit card debts, handed them the down payment for their house, and continued to pay the property taxes on it under the guise of an annual gift. I had been the bank, the investor, and the safety net. I had done it out of love, but now I needed to see it through a different lens. Not as gifts, but as liabilities. While Marcus began digging into a decade of my financial life, I turned my attention to the second front, Amelia. If she was a hostile takeover artist, I needed to understand the company she was trying to acquire, me, and the one she represented, herself. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Frank Costello, a man whose online reviews praised his discretion and his tenacity. My instructions to Frank were simple. "I want to know everything about Amelia Finch, née Caldwell," I told him in a quiet corner of a coffee shop far from my usual haunts. "I want her professional life examined. I want to know about her cases, her clients, her reputation at Sterling and Croft. Is she a star, or is she skating on thin ice? I want to know about her personal life, too. Debts, habits, friends. Everything. She is trying to declare me mentally incompetent. I want to know just how competent, and how ethical, she really is." Frank nodded slowly, taking notes in a small, worn spiral notebook. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think people who build their lives on lies tend to have messy blueprints," I said. The days leading up to the hearing were a strange, surreal performance. David would call, his voice dripping with false concern. "Dad, are you eating okay? Just wanted to check in. Amelia and I are just so worried about you." I played the part of the slightly confused, forgetful old man they believed me to be. I'd forget what day it was, ask him to repeat himself, feign confusion about a recent conversation. I needed them to walk into that courtroom brimming with confidence, armed with their anecdotes of my decline. Every conversation was a lie, a carefully placed stone on the path to their own ambush. I was letting them build their case, brick by brick, unaware that I was rigging the entire foundation with explosives. While they were rehearsing their lines, my team was assembling the ammunition. Marcus's first report was staggering. He presented it to me not as a spreadsheet, but as a story. The story of nearly $2 million. That was the amount I had poured into David and Amelia's life over the past 10 years. The failed businesses weren't just failures. Marcus uncovered evidence that David had used significant portions of the seed money to fund a lavish lifestyle, leases on luxury cars, trips to Europe, expensive watches. The loans were never documented as such, always cashed and absorbed into their general accounts, which were perpetually overdrawn. Amelia's salary was substantial, but their spending was astronomical. They weren't just living beyond their means, they were living beyond mine. Marcus also found something else, a detail hidden in the fine print of their mortgage documents. The Arcadia house, the one I had gifted them the $200,000 down payment for, had recently been refinanced. They had pulled out every dime of equity, leveraging it to the hilt. They were in debt, deeply and desperately. My fortress wasn't just a prize, it was a lifeline they needed to avoid drowning. Then, 3 days before the hearing, Frank Costello called me. He'd found something on Amelia. Something big. "Arthur, you were right about the blueprints," he said, his voice low. "They're not just messy. They're fraudulent." He told me he needed to show me the documents in person. The war was about to escalate far beyond a simple family dispute. This was no longer just about defending my freedom. It was about exposing a rot that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. The hearing wasn't going to be my judgment day. It was going to be theirs. I stood in my study, the room where I had drafted plans for countless buildings, surrounded by the books and memories of a long life. The navy blue portfolio they had presented to me was now in my possession. I'd had my lawyer request a copy. I ran my hand over the embossed title, The Estate of Arthur Finch. They thought it was a history book, a final record of a life that was over. They had no idea I was about to write a brand new, and far more brutal, final chapter. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best suit, a charcoal gray wool I hadn't worn since my wife's funeral. It felt appropriate. Today was another kind of death. The death of the man my son thought I was, and the death of the life he and his wife had built. I arrived at the Maricopa County Superior Court building in downtown Phoenix an hour early. I didn't go to the designated courtroom. Instead, I went to a small, empty waiting area on a different floor and sat, watching the minutes tick by on the large institutional clock. I needed the quiet. I needed to center myself, to transform the grief and rage into a cold, hard instrument of precision. My new lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Jessica Riley, whom I had hired the day after walking out of that conference room, would be meeting me at the courtroom. She had the files from Marcus and Frank. She had her instructions. She knew this wasn't a standard conservatorship defense. This was a counteroffensive. When I finally walked into the courtroom, 5 minutes before the proceedings were scheduled to begin, the scene was exactly as I had pictured it. Amelia and David were sitting at the petitioner's table, whispering to their lawyer, a slick-looking man named Peterson whose face screamed expensive and unethical. Amelia looked confident, dressed in a severe navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. She gave me a brief, pitying glance as I entered, a look one might give a doddering old relative who'd wandered into the wrong room. David, as usual, was studying the scuff marks on his Italian leather shoes. They had their star witness with them, Dr. Evans, the young, ambitious doctor they'd found for me. He sat in the front row, looking self-important, his prepared testimony no doubt full of clinical terms for my supposed senility. They looked like a professional, caring family executing a painful but necessary duty. The image was perfect. And it was a complete lie. I walked to the respondent's table and sat down next to Jessica. She gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "Ready, Arthur?" she whispered. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," I said, my eyes fixed on my son. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Carmichael, entered, and the room fell silent. She read the basics of the case aloud, her voice a monotone drone. Petition to place Arthur Finch under a probate conservatorship, citing cognitive decline and an inability to manage his own financial and personal affairs. Peterson, Amelia's lawyer, began. He painted a masterful picture of a beloved patriarch lost in the fog of old age. He spoke of my fall, my episodes of confusion, my increasing paranoia. He framed their petition as an act of love, a desperate attempt to protect me from myself. He called Dr. Evans to the stand. Dr. Evans was smooth. He spoke about the mini-mental state examination he had administered, noting my hesitation on certain questions. He talked about my anecdotal memory loss, reported to him, of course, by my loving son and daughter-in-law. He used phrases like executive function impairment and potential onset of dementia. He was convincing. He was professional. He was, as Frank Costello had discovered, a complete fraud. As Peterson concluded his questioning with a dramatic, "No further questions for this compassionate, concerned physician," Jessica rose slowly. She approached the witness stand, her file in her hand. "Dr. Evans," she began, her voice calm and pleasant. "You've built quite a reputation for yourself in the field of geriatrics, haven't you? Especially in providing expert testimony for conservatorship cases." Dr. Evans puffed out his chest slightly. "I offer my professional opinion where it is needed, yes. And your professional opinion is that my client, Mr. Finch, is incompetent? My evaluation suggests a significant cognitive decline that warrants the oversight requested by his family," he said smugly. "I see," Jessica said, opening her file. "Is it also your professional opinion that it's acceptable to have your medical license funded by the very law firm you provide testimony for?" The color drained from Dr. Evans' face. Amelia sat bolt upright. Peterson jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance?" "Overruled," Judge Carmichael said, her eyes now narrowed with interest. "Answer the question, Doctor." Jessica didn't wait for his stammering response. She placed a document on the projector. It was a copy of a canceled check. A very large check, made out to the medical school Dr. Evans had attended, from a philanthropic fund that Frank Costello had traced back to a shell corporation. And that shell corporation, in turn, was funded exclusively by Sterling and Croft, Amelia's law firm. "This, Your Honor," Jessica announced to the silent courtroom, "is one of 4 sizable donations made by Amelia Finch's firm to entities directly benefiting Dr. Evans financially over the past 2 years. In return, Dr. Evans has provided favorable testimony in 6 conservatorship cases brought by the firm. He isn't a physician. He's a paid witness, a hired gun to rubber stamp their elder grabs." The air went out of the room. Dr. Evans was sputtering, Peterson was frantically flipping through his notes, but Amelia's face was a mask of pure, cold fury. She shot a look at me, and for the first time, the pity was gone. It was replaced by hate. The foundation of their case had just been dynamited. But I knew this was only the beginning. Jessica wasn't done. "No further questions for the doctor," she said with dripping sarcasm. As a flustered Dr. Evans scurried from the stand, Jessica turned her attention to the petitioner's table. "The prosecution calls Amelia Finch to the stand." Peterson was on his feet again. "Your Honor, my client is the petitioner, not a witness for the respondent. She has submitted a sworn declaration in this case, full of accusations against my client's character and competence," Jessica countered smoothly. "I have every right to cross-examine her on the contents of that declaration." Judge Carmichael waved a dismissive hand. "Mrs. Finch, take the stand." Reluctantly, Amelia walked to the stand, her composure regained, her face once again an unreadable mask of professionalism. She believed she could handle this. She believed she was smarter than anyone in the room. That was her fatal flaw. That was the flaw I was counting on. Jessica let her settle in before she began. "Mrs. Finch, in your declaration, you state that you are deeply concerned that your father-in-law is being preyed upon by financial predators due to his, what was the phrase you used? His deteriorating financial acumen?" "That's correct," Amelia said, her voice steady. "We are worried he could be taken advantage of." "A noble sentiment," Jessica said, walking slowly towards the witness box. "It's interesting you should bring up financial predation. Let's talk about your own finances, shall we? You and your husband live in a beautiful home in Arcadia, do you not?" "Objection. My client's personal finances are not on trial here," Peterson shouted. "Your Honor," Jessica said, turning to the judge, "the petitioner's entire case rests on the idea that they are acting as selfless protectors of Mr. Finch's estate. Their motive is central to this case. If that motive is not love, but desperate financial need, it calls their entire petition into question." The judge leaned forward, her gaze locked on Amelia. "I'll allow it. But be brief, Ms. Riley." Jessica turned back to Amelia. "You and your husband have a combined income of over $300,000 a year, correct?" "That's a matter of public record," Amelia said stiffly. And yet, Jessica continued, pulling out one of Marcus's summary sheets, you currently have over $100,000 in high-interest credit card debt, 2 car loans that are underwater, and you recently leveraged your home to the point where you have virtually no equity left. Is that also correct? Amelia's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the witness box. My personal finances are complex. They're not complex, Mrs. Finch. They're catastrophic, Jessica said, her voice sharp as a razor. You're drowning in debt. And you saw your father-in-law not as a man to be cared for, but as a bailout package. A living ATM whose PIN code you were trying to steal through the courts. The metaphor hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. I watched David. He had shrunk in his chair, his face pale. The truth, when spoken so plainly, was a brutal thing. Jessica wasn't finished. She moved from their personal debt to the money I had given them. She presented Marcus's detailed accounting of the $2 million. The failed businesses. The siphoned funds. The gifts that propped up their unsustainable lifestyle. With each exhibit, she wasn't just defending me, she was prosecuting them. She was showing the court, and the world, that the only people financially exploiting Arthur Finch were the 2 people sitting at the petitioner's table. Then, for the grand finale, Jessica brought up the file from Frank Costello. Mrs. Finch, she said, her tone shifting from prosecutorial to something quieter, more dangerous. Let's talk about your professional life. You're a partner at Sterling and Croft, a very prestigious position. I am, Amelia said, a hint of her old pride returning. She was on safer ground now, or so she thought. And you specialize in corporate law, correct? Mergers and acquisitions? Among other things. Specifically, Jessica said, reading from a page, you were the lead attorney on the acquisition of the sustainable energy startup Soltec by the venture capital firm Innovest Holdings last year, weren't you? For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic appeared in Amelia's eyes. It was a tiny crack in her marble facade, but I saw it. That was one of my cases, yes. And you personally vouched for Soltec's financials, for the validity of their patents, for their projected earnings? I performed the standard due diligence, of course. Jessica placed a new set of documents on the projector. They were internal emails, leaked by a disgruntled former employee of Innovest whom Frank had tracked down. Then perhaps you can explain these emails, Mrs. Finch. Emails between you and the CEO of Soltec, sent just weeks before the acquisition closed. Emails in which he explicitly admits that their primary patent was based on stolen research and that their revenue projections were, and I quote, optimistically fabricated. Emails in which you advised him on how to best conceal this information from the investors at Innovest. The courtroom was utterly silent. Peterson was staring at the screen, his mouth agape. He'd been played, too. Amelia's face had gone from pale to a ghastly shade of gray. The documents on the screen weren't just evidence of unethical behavior, they were proof of felony fraud. She had knowingly and willingly facilitated a multi-million-dollar corporate crime. You see, Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice ringing with cold triumph, this was never about my client's mind. It was about his money. And Mrs. Finch's entire career, her entire life, appears to be built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. She defrauds investors at work, and she tries to defraud her own family at home. This petition is not an act of love. It is an act of profound and criminal desperation. Jessica walked back to our table and sat down. She had said all she needed to say. The fortress Amelia had built around herself, the one made of professional prestige and icy superiority, had been leveled to the ground in under an hour. Judge Carmichael stared at Amelia, who was frozen on the witness stand, a statue of hubris shattered into a million pieces. The judge's face was a thundercloud. Mrs. Finch, the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. You may step down. Amelia practically stumbled out of the box, avoiding the eyes of everyone, especially her husband. The judge then looked at Peterson. Mr. Peterson, I trust you have a motion for me. Peterson, looking like he'd just been run over by a truck, stammered, Why yes, Your Honor. The petitioners wish to withdraw their petition. Petition withdrawn, Judge Carmichael snapped. With prejudice. Which means you can never file it again. And Miss Finch, she said, her voice dropping even lower, causing Amelia to flinch, I am referring the evidence presented here today regarding the Soltech acquisition to the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office. You can expect to hear from them. This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. It was over. I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. As the courtroom began to empty, I sat perfectly still, watching my son and his wife. David finally looked at me, his face a mess of terror and disbelief. He started to take a step towards me, his hand outstretched, a desperate plea forming on his lips. But Amelia grabbed his arm, her grip like a vice. She whispered something venomous in his ear and pulled him towards the exit, her head held high in a last, pathetic act of defiance. They disappeared through the doors, not as a loving family, but as co-conspirators fleeing the scene of a crime. I had survived. I had protected my fortress. But the cost was immense. To save my life, I had been forced to utterly destroy my sons. Jessica put her hand on my shoulder. Arthur, we did it. I nodded, but my eyes remained on the door they had disappeared through. The legal battle was over, but I knew the war was not. Amelia was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. I had exposed her lies, but I hadn't yet seen the full extent of her capacity for revenge. She wouldn't go down without trying to burn everything and everyone to the ground. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that her first target would not be me. It would be the weakest link. It would be my son. The weeks that followed the hearing were steady in silence. A heavy, suffocating silence from my son's house in Arcadia. The phone didn't ring. No apologetic emails appeared in my inbox. No desperate, tearful man showed up on my doorstep. It was as if, after the public demolition of their lives, David and Amelia had ceased to exist. But I knew better. This wasn't peace. It was the eerie calm before a storm. The State Bar had indeed opened an investigation into Amelia, and the DA's office had convened a grand jury. Her career, her entire professional identity, was circling the drain. A woman like Amelia doesn't accept defeat. She reloads. Frank Costello, my investigator, kept a discreet watch on them. His reports painted a grim picture. Their house went up for sale in a hurry, a for sale sign planted on the manicured lawn like a tombstone. They were liquidating. But they weren't just selling their house, they were scorching the earth. They defaulted on their car loans. They maxed out every remaining credit card on cash advances. They were pulling every last cent from the wreckage before the banks and creditors could close in. It was a frantic, desperate cash grab. But for what? To run? To hire a team of miracle-working defense attorneys? The answer came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a phone call or a letter. It was a courier, delivering a thick envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was not a lawsuit against me, but something far more insidious. It was a petition for divorce. David Finch versus Amelia Finch. My first thought was a flicker of hope. Had David finally seen her for what she was? Had he finally found the courage to cut the cancer out of his life? But as I read further, a cold dread washed over me. The petition was brutal. It accused Amelia of emotional abuse, financial malfeasance, and infidelity. But woven into the legal jargon was a narrative, a carefully crafted story designed for a single purpose. It painted David as a victim, a loving son who had been manipulated by his brilliant, ruthless wife. It claimed Amelia had been the sole architect of the conservatorship plot, that she had preyed on David's concern for his aging father and twisted it into a greedy scheme. It alleged she had coerced him, lied to him, and that he was just as much a victim of her fraud as the investors of Soltech. It was a masterpiece of fiction. It was Amelia's last, desperate play. She wasn't trying to save her marriage. She was trying to save herself. By making David the plaintiff in a contentious divorce, by having him expose her, she was creating a firewall. She was turning my son into her star witness, a sympathetic character whose testimony could be used to mitigate her own culpability in the fraud investigation. I was under the control of my abusive, manipulative wife. It was a classic defense. And to make it work, she needed to sever every tie between David and me. The petition was also a declaration of war on me. Tucked into the asset declarations was a shocking claim. David was laying claim to 50% of my company, Finch Engineering, alleging that I had made a verbal promise to him years ago that the company was his inheritance, and that his years of consulting for me constituted sweat equity. It was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication. I had never made such a promise. His consulting had been him showing up for coffee once a month. But it was a brilliant, vicious move. She was using my son to bleed me dry, to tie me up in litigation for years, to punish me for exposing her. I called Jessica Riley immediately. "It's a scorched earth tactic, Arthur," she confirmed, her voice grim after I emailed her the documents. "She's sacrificing her husband to save herself. By making him sue you, she drives an irreparable wedge between you. It isolates him, makes him completely dependent on her and her legal team for his own survival. He thinks he's fighting for his future, but he's just a pawn in her endgame. A pawn. My son, my only child, was a willing piece in his wife's chess game, even if it meant destroying his own father." The pain of that realization was sharper than anything that had happened in the courtroom. The conservatorship had been about greed. This was about pure, unadulterated vengeance. They couldn't get my money through the front door, so they were sending my own son to smash in the back window and rob me blind, all while Amelia directed him from the getaway car. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the old headquarters of Finch Engineering. The company was largely run by a board and a CEO I'd handpicked, but I still owned the building and held a controlling interest. I let myself in with my old key, the brass worn smooth from decades of use. The offices were dark and quiet, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and old paper. I walked through the drafting room, where blueprints for 100 buildings were still stored in long, flat files. I went to my old office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Phoenix skyline, a skyline I had helped shape. I sat in my old leather chair, the one that still bore the imprint of my body after so many years. I looked out at the city lights, at the monuments to my life's work. I had built things that were meant to last. Things of concrete and steel and integrity. And Amelia, with her world of paper lies and legal maneuvering, was trying to tear it all down. She thought she could win in that world. She thought she could hide behind motions and depositions and drag this out until I was too tired, too old, or too dead to fight. But I wasn't an accountant or a lawyer. I was an engineer. I understood structures. I knew that even the most formidable-looking fortress has a load-bearing wall, a single point of failure. If you take it out, the entire thing comes crashing down. Amelia's fortress was her intricate web of lies. Her point of failure was her belief that she controlled my son. She thought David was her pawn, her weapon. She didn't realize that a weapon can be turned against its master. A new plan began to form in my mind, a plan far more audacious than simply defending myself in court. I wasn't going to fight their lawsuit. I was going to end it before it even began. I was going to take out the load-bearing wall. I was going to get my son back, not through forgiveness or pleading, but by showing him the truth of the cage he was in. And to do that, I would need to use Amelia's own tactics against her. I would need to set a trap, and I would need to use the one thing she couldn't control as bait, my legacy. The next day, I had Jessica file a motion. It was not a denial of David's claim, nor a countersuit. It was an offer. A breathtakingly generous offer. I proposed to place my entire controlling interest in Finch Engineering, worth north of $50 million, into an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust would be my son, David. The offer came with two conditions. First, he had to drop the lawsuit immediately. Second, because of the clear and present outside influence that had led to this unfortunate family conflict, the trust would be administered by a neutral third-party fiduciary. David would receive a generous annual income from it, but he would have no control over the principal. Not now, and not ever. The control would lie with the trustee. When Jessica first read my instructions, she thought I'd lost my mind. Arthur, you're giving him everything. After what he did? You're handing them the keys to the kingdom. No, Jessica, I told her calmly. I'm not giving them anything. I'm giving him a choice. And I'm building a new kind of fortress, one that Amelia can't touch. The offer was a strategic masterpiece of psychological warfare. To David, it would look like a complete capitulation, an old man's desperate attempt to buy back his son's love. It was more money than he could have ever dreamed of winning in a lawsuit, and it was his, free and clear. There was no way he could refuse. But to Amelia, the offer would be a declaration of war. An irrevocable trust administered by a third party was a vault she could never crack. She couldn't manipulate the trustee. She couldn't force David to liquidate the assets. She couldn't get her hands on the principal in a divorce settlement. The money would be David's, and David's alone, forever out of her reach. I was betting everything on one thing, Amelia's greed. I knew she would not, could not, allow David to accept that deal. Her entire plan hinged on getting a massive payout from me, either through the lawsuit or a divorce settlement. My offer gave David a golden parachute, but it gave her nothing. She would have to force him to reject it. And in doing so, she would have to reveal her true motivations to my son in a way he could no longer deny. The offer wasn't a peace treaty. It was a poison pill. As expected, their lawyer's office went silent for 3 days. I could picture the arguments, the screaming matches happening inside that house. Amelia, trying to convince David that it was a trick, that they could get more by fighting. David, looking at a guaranteed lifetime of immense wealth, torn between his wife's promises and the tangible reality of my offer. While they stewed, I moved on to the second part of my plan. I needed to give my son a way out. I needed to show him what his wife had really done. Frank Costello had uncovered the name of the disgruntled former employee from Innovest Holdings, the one who had leaked the emails about the Soltech fraud. The man's name was Daniel Ramirez. He had been a junior analyst at the firm, and he had been fired for insubordination after he raised questions about the Soltech deal. He had lost everything. He was a loose cannon, and he hated Amelia Finch with a passion. He was perfect. I had Frank arrange a meeting. Not with me, but with someone else. I called the only other family I had left, my niece, Sarah. She was my late sister's daughter, a smart, compassionate psychologist who lived in San Diego. I had always been fond of her, but we weren't close. I had kept my distance, a foolish old man wrapped up in his own world. Now, I needed her. I told her everything. The whole sordid story. I didn't ask her to take my side, I just asked her to listen. And then I asked her for a favor. Sarah, I said over the phone, I need you to talk to David. Not as my emissary, but as his cousin. As family. He won't listen to me. But he might listen to you. The final piece of the trap was the most delicate. I knew David and Amelia's phones were likely being monitored by her own lawyers. I needed a way to get a message to him that she couldn't intercept. I thought about the boy he used to be, before Amelia, before the money and the disappointment. I remembered the secret hiding place we'd had when he was a kid, and a hollowed-out book in my study, an old copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. It was where we used to leave secret notes for each other. It was a long shot, a desperate hope that some small part of that boy was still alive inside the man he had become. The day before my offer was set to expire, I put a single, handwritten note inside that book. It contained only a time, a date, and the address of a small, quiet park in Sedona. At the bottom, I wrote a single line, "Your cousin Sarah wants to see you. Come alone." Then, I sent David a bland, formal email, one I knew Amelia would read. It simply said, "David, before this goes any further, there are some old family photo albums in my study you should have. Please feel free to come by the house tomorrow afternoon to pick them up. I will not be there." The bait was set. The trap was sprung. All I could do now was wait and see if my son would walk into it, or if he was already too far gone, forever lost in the fortress of lies his wife had built around him. The email was a calculated risk. It had to sound innocent enough for Amelia to dismiss, yet specific enough to pique David's curiosity. Mentioning the photo albums was a key detail. It was a nod to a past he might feel a sentimental pull towards, a past that she wasn't a part of. She would see it as a pathetic, sentimental gesture from a beaten old man. She might even encourage him to go, to collect any personal effects before the legal war truly began. My hope was that he would go to the study, that some flicker of memory would draw him to the bookshelf, to that specific, worn leather binding of the Count of Monte Cristo. It was a gamble on a ghost. For 24 hours, my house was silent. I stayed away, as promised, bunking in a suite at the Arizona Biltmore, a hotel whose original structure I had studied with reverence my entire career. I sat on the balcony, nursing a single glass of scotch, and watched the sun set over Piestewa Peak. I felt like a general on the eve of a battle, having moved all his pieces into place, now utterly powerless to control the outcome. Had I misjudged him completely? Was there anything left of the sun I'd raised? Or was he now just a hollowed-out shell, animated solely by his wife's ambition and greed? The call came the next afternoon. It wasn't from David. It was from Sarah. He came, Uncle Arthur, she said, her voice soft but steady. He's with me now. I closed my eyes, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. How is he? He's a wreck, she said bluntly. He's broken. He's been crying for the past hour. She paused. I showed him the file you gave me. The one from Daniel Ramirez. That was the other half of the trap. The meeting I'd had Frank Costello arrange wasn't between Daniel and me. It was between Daniel and a videographer. For a modest fee, the disgraced analyst had been more than happy to sit down and tell his story on camera. He detailed, with righteous anger, how Amelia had not just ignored his warnings about the Soltec fraud, but had actively conspired with the CEO to hide it, and then orchestrated his firing to silence him. He had emails, documents, and a credibility born of pure, unadulterated fury. The video was a damning, undeniable account of Amelia's criminality, told by one of her victims. I had made sure Sarah had a copy of it on her tablet. He believed it? I asked, my voice tight. He had no choice, Sarah said. It wasn't you telling him. It was a stranger, a man his wife had ruined. It made it real. Then he told me about your offer, about the trust. He said Amelia went insane. She forbade him from taking it, called him a fool, told him they would get 10 times that much when they won the lawsuit and forced the sale of the company. He said it was the first time he realized she didn't care if he was happy. She just cared about winning. The load-bearing wall was crumbling. Amelia's greed, her fatal flaw, had made her overplay her hand. By forcing David to reject a life of absolute security in favor of her high-stakes gamble, she had finally shown him that he was not her partner, but her collateral. What now? I asked Sarah. He's terrified, she said. He knows he's complicit, at least in the eyes of the law, for filing that lawsuit. He's afraid of her. He thinks she'll destroy him. She will, I said. Unless he helps us destroy her first. Put him on the phone, Sarah. There was a moment of silence, then a choked, hesitant voice. Dad? I had rehearsed 100 speeches for this moment. Speeches full of anger, of recrimination, of righteous fury. I threw them all away. All he needed to hear was the one thing Amelia could never offer him, a way out. David, I said, my voice even. You have made a series of catastrophic mistakes. You have betrayed my trust, and you have aligned yourself with a woman who would see us both ruined for her own gain. That is the truth. But here is another truth. You are my son. And I will not let her take you down with her. I could hear him sobbing on the other end. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was weak. I know, I said, cutting him off. There would be time for apologies later. Maybe. Right now, we don't have time for weakness. We have time for a choice. You can stay with her and go down on a sinking ship of lies, or you can help me end this. You can help me make sure that the only person who pays for Amelia's crimes is Amelia. What do you want me to do? He whispered. My instructions were precise. I had Jessica Riley draft a new affidavit for him. In it, David would recant every allegation from his lawsuit, stating that he had been coerced into filing it by his wife, Amelia, under duress and the threat of financial and emotional ruin. He would state that the verbal contract for the company was a complete fabrication of her invention. He would also agree, in writing, to cooperate fully with the district attorney's investigation into both the Soltec fraud and Amelia's attempt to commit fraud upon the court with the conservatorship petition. But that wasn't the master stroke. The final move was aimed directly at Amelia's legal strategy. David, I said, Amelia is building her defense around the idea that you were her victim. We're going to give her exactly what she wants. He was to go home. He was to tell Amelia he had thought about it and she was right. The trust was a trap. He was with her, 100%. He would play the part of the dutiful, penitent husband, completely back under her thumb. And then, he would record her. We supplied him with a micro-recorder, a tiny device easily concealed in a shirt pocket. His job was to get Amelia to talk. To get her to admit, in her own words, that the lawsuit was her idea. That she had fabricated the verbal contract story. That she was coaching him on what to say. That her plan was to use him as a shield to protect herself from the DA. Every word she spoke would be another nail in her own coffin. The next 2 days were the most agonizing of my life. David was back in the lion's den, and I could only pray he had the courage to see it through. He would send me short, coded texts. Dinner was quiet. She's working late. She's suspicious. Then, on the third night, a new text arrived. Just 3 words. I have it. David met me and Jessica at a discreet hotel conference room the next morning. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He was pale and shaking, but in his hand was the small digital recorder. She was proud of it, he said, his voice trembling. She was gloating. She called it a bulletproof narrative. She walked me through the whole plan, how I would testify, how she would make the jury weep for the poor, manipulated husband. It's all there. We listened to the recording. It was horrifying and exhilarating at the same time. It was Amelia, in her own arrogant, confident voice, laying out her entire fraudulent defense, admitting to suborning perjury, admitting to fabricating evidence, and, most damningly, admitting that her goal was to leave that old man with nothing but the dust on his blueprints. Jessica Riley looked at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. Checkmate, she whispered. We didn't file the recording with the court. We didn't send it to the opposing counsel. That would have been the conventional move. But this wasn't a conventional war. This was about dismantling a fortress, and you don't warn the occupants before you light the fuse. Jessica arranged a settlement conference at her own office. She invited Amelia and her lawyer, Peterson, under the guise of discussing a potential counteroffer to David's lawsuit. Amelia, I'm sure, walked in expecting us to offer more money, to sweeten the pot. She would see it as a sign of our weakening resolve. She arrived looking imperious and confident, with David trailing a few steps behind her like a beaten dog. It was the last time I would ever see that look on her face. We all sat around a large mahogany table. My son sat next to his wife, refusing to look at me. The performance was flawless. Peterson began, blustering about the strength of their case, the validity of David's claim. I let him talk for 5 minutes, and then I held up a hand to stop him. There will be no counteroffer, I said, my voice calm and clear. I looked directly at Amelia. There will be no settlement. The lawsuit is being dropped. David has already signed the motion to dismiss. Amelia laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. He wouldn't do that. I wouldn't let him. Oh, But he has, Jessica said, sliding a signed copy of the dismissal across the table. And he has also signed a new affidavit. One that tells a very different story from the one you invented. Amelia's eyes darted from the document to David's ashen face. For the first time, she saw the trap. The blood drained from her face. David? What is this? She hissed. David, my son, finally looked up. He looked at his wife, the woman who had remade him in her own corrupt image, and he found a single, solitary spark of the man he was supposed to be. It's over, Amelia, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it filled the room. It's not over, she snarled, turning on me, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. I'll ruin you. I'll tell the world. You'll tell them what, Amelia? I interrupted, my voice as cold as ice. That you tried to frame your husband as your victim? That you fabricated a multi-million-dollar lawsuit? That you coached him to commit perjury? Would you like to hear it in your own words? And then Jessica pressed play. Amelia's voice, amplified by a small speaker in the center of the table, filled the conference room. Her confident, conniving voice, boasting about her bulletproof narrative, laying out her crimes one by one. I watched her face collapse. The arrogance, the defiance, the hate, it all melted away, replaced by the stark, primal terror of a predator who has just realized it is no longer the hunter, but the prey. Peterson, her own lawyer, was staring at her in slack-jawed horror. He was witnessing the implosion of his client and, quite possibly, his own career for having ever associated with her. When the recording finished, the silence was absolute. Here's what is going to happen, Jessica said, her voice clinical and precise. You are going to sign a divorce settlement, right now, in which you waive any and all claims to any of David's assets, present or future, including anything he may inherit from his father. You will walk away with nothing. You will also sign a confession, detailing your role in the Soltech fraud and your attempts to suborn perjury in this matter. We will deliver that confession, along with this recording, to the district attorney's office. It may not save you, but it's the only chance you have of avoiding a trial that would make you infamous. She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. If you refuse, we will walk out of this room and release this recording not just to the DA, but to every major news outlet in the state. Your bulletproof narrative will be the 6 o'clock news. Amelia didn't speak. She just stared at the speaker as if it were a venomous snake. All the fight was gone. She was a hollowed-out ruin, the foundations of her life pulverized into dust. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling violently, and signed the documents that Jessica pushed in front of her. The divorce settlement. The confession. The end of her life as she knew it. She signed away her marriage, her wealth, and her freedom, all in the space of 5 minutes. When she was done, she stood up, a ghost in a designer suit. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at David. She just walked out of the room, her footsteps silent, a woman already erased. The silence she left behind was heavy with the wreckage of our family. David sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The war was over. The fortress of lies was a pile of rubble. We had won. But standing there, in the ruins, it felt as though we had all lost. I did not reinstate my original offer of the trust. To do so would have felt like a reward, and what David had done was beyond rewarding. The photo albums he'd retrieved from my study now sat on his small table in the sad, furnished apartment he rented after the Arcadia house was sold in a fire sale by the bank. Our relationship did not snap back into place. There was no tearful reunion, no Hollywood ending where all was forgiven. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too profound. A chasm had been blasted between us, and I did not know if it could ever be bridged. Amelia, true to Jessica's prediction, took a plea deal. Her confession, coupled with the recording, was overwhelming. She was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud. Her name appeared in the business section of the Arizona Republic one last time, not as a titan of industry, but as a cautionary tale. A footnote in the history of corporate greed. David began the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage. He got a simple job, managing inventory at a logistics company. He was paying his own rent, buying his own groceries, for the first time in his adult life. We spoke occasionally, in short, stilted phone calls that skirted the edges of the wound between us. He was apologetic, endlessly so, but apologies were just words. They couldn't unsign the documents. They couldn't unsay the lies. They couldn't erase the memory of him sitting at that table, ready to declare his own father incompetent for a pile of money. Sometimes I would drive past the old house in Arcadia, the one I had helped them buy, and see a new family living there, their children's bicycles scattered on the lawn where my grandchildren used to play. A life had existed there, a life I had funded and supported, and it had all been built on a foundation of sand. It had looked so strong, so perfect from the outside. A fortress. About a year after Amelia went to prison, I received a simple, handwritten letter. It was from David. There were no apologies in it, no excuses. It was just a few sentences about his new life. He wrote about his job, about learning to cook for himself, about the quiet satisfaction of paying a bill with money he had earned himself. At the end of the letter, he wrote one line that lodged itself in my heart. For the first time, he wrote, "I think I understand the difference between having wealth and having worth." I put the letter down on the desk in my study, next to the old, hollowed-out copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive him. I didn't know if he could ever truly forgive himself. The fortress they built was gone, reduced to ash and bitter memories, and in its place was just the quiet, echoing silence of what we had lost. I had won the war, saved my legacy, and protected my freedom. But even now, alone in the house I built, I sometimes wonder who was truly left imprisoned in the rubble. The end.